Miami, Florida, 1994. It's late at night, and Daniel Lugo walks into a warehouse. Inside, a wealthy man named Marc Schiller is sitting in a chair, almost beaten to death, while two other men are getting him drunk against his will. This man has been kidnapped for almost a month by Lugo's gang, and now they're ready to get rid of him. Schiller is taken out of the warehouse to a van with his face covered and handcuffed. The van filled with Lugo and his gang drove away to end what they started. Or maybe it was just the beginning. Three years earlier, in 1991, Daniel Lugo, a bodybuilder originally from New York, moved to Miami seeking a better life. He pretended to be an associate for a Hong Kong bank looking to invest in a small business across America. His scheme was simple. He collected the fees up front, pretending to be loan insurance, and then would stall for months until disappearing with the money. Eventually, he was arrested and pleaded guilty for fraud. He served 15 months with 3 years of federal probation. In 1994, after being released, he got the job as a manager for a local gym in the Miami area, the Sun Gym. He worked alongside Adrian Doorbal, Carl Weeks, Stevenson Pierre, and Jorge Delgado. Jorge Delgado originally had a business with a partner named Marc Schiller. However, a fallout in their business led them to go separate ways. Lugo knew that this partner had a lot of money, and he knew that he was the perfect target. And during a training session, Lugo asked Doorbal and Pierre if they're interested in making $100,000 for 2 days of work. They accepted the job, thinking that they were just going to pressure the man. They turned out to be very wrong. The plan went something like this. First, he wanted to kidnap Schiller, then take him to a warehouse owned by Delgado. From then, they would pressure him and force him to sign away all his money. The best part about this plan is that Schiller wouldn't be able to say anything about his money because it was made through fraudulent activities. Lugo didn't tell them at that moment, but his plan never involved leaving him alive. It's Halloween night, and the gang made a simple plan. Knock on the door, wait for the response, and get Schiller. The gang soon realized that 3 bodybuilders dressed up as ninjas were noticeable and quickly aborted the mission. Schiller is driving in rush hour traffic. A van quickly approaches and blocks the front of Schiller's car. From then, 2 men drop out of the van. However, this was horribly executed, and by the time the men had left the van, Schiller simply changed lanes and went out the highway. Schiller usually grabbed his papers from the front door at 5 a.m. Knowing everything would be dark and few people would be around, the gang decided that this would be the perfect opportunity. They hid under a black blanket and waited for Schiller to come out. At 5 a.m., he opens the front door and picks up his paper. The bodybuilders see this as their chance, but a car passing by scares them away. In the end, it's known that the gang had 7 failed attempts at kidnapping Marc Schiller. They were struggling and decided to drop Pierre and bring in Mario Sanchez, another ex-instructor from the gym. Delgado mentioned that Schiller had a Schlotzsky's franchise, giving Lugo the idea to wait for him in the parking lot and then kidnap him. On November 14th, 1994, Schiller was waiting to have a meeting with a prospective buyer of a Schlotzsky's franchise. At 4 p.m., the buyer didn't arrive, and Schiller decided to leave. While he was waiting across the parking lot, 3 men approached him. One of them stunned him with a taser, and the 2 others punched him and forced him into the van. Lugo couldn't believe it. Finally, after 7 attempts, his plan had worked. And now they could focus on phase 2. The Sun Gym gang took Schiller and his car to Delgado's warehouse. This was important because the gang planned to make Schiller's disappearance look as if he escaped with a younger woman leaving the country and his family. First, they forced him to call his wife, telling her to go to Latin America. Schiller was originally from Argentina, and he took his family to the States for a safer life. But now he had to ask them to leave the country without a specific explanation. He wasn't prepared for what came next. Schiller was blindfolded at all times at the warehouse, while they tried to intimidate him and torture him with tasers, punches, pistol whips, and burns with lighters. Things went from bad to worse when the gang realized that it would take several weeks to move the money from his accounts. What originally seemed like a 2-day kidnapping would now take weeks. From week 2, Schiller used a bag on his head, and the gang started to add new intimidation methods like Russian roulette and performed executions. The once foolish gang of criminals now became a group of sadists. They made him sign document after document while calling his friends, family, and attorney with a series of spoken scripts to explain his disappearance. By December 14th, he had already been kidnapped for 4 weeks. The gang gave him his last document, where he would give up all his fortune and wills, amounting to a total of $1.26 million. It's at this point where the gang decided to start Phase 3. That same day, the gang drove 3 blocks away from the Schlotzskys Schiller owned. They got Schiller drunk and forced him to consume sleeping pills. Then they put him behind the wheel of his own car, and Lugo stomped the gas pedal towards a concrete pole, nearly escaping out the passenger seat before the collision. Surprisingly, Schiller was alive. In a moment of desperation, Lugo threw gasoline all over the car and then lit it on fire. From a distance, they watched Schiller crawl out of the car, still on fire. The gang decided to finish the job and ran him over twice. They were ready to run him over a 3rd time. However, a car approaching in the distance made them flee. Miraculously, through all this pain and all this torture, Schiller had survived. Marc Schiller woke up in the Jackson Memorial Hospital and was treated as a DUI case. When the police arrived, Schiller explained everything that happened. However, explaining this story sounded extremely crazy, and the police didn't believe his fantastical story and just let him go free. The gang, on the other hand, was panicking and decided to call the morgue and ask for people with characteristics matching Schiller's. They got no matches, so they decided to call hospitals to discover where he was, and eventually they found out that he was alive. The gang had some unfinished business to solve, and so they arrived at the hospital dressed up as doctors, ready to kill Schiller, only to discover that he checked himself out. The gang didn't know that Schiller had escaped to New York. However, they did know that he had talked to the police, and that no police was believing his story. May 20th, 1995, the Sun Gym gang spent almost all their money from their previous heist. They're desperate, especially Doorbal, who informs the gang about another wealthy man called Frank Griga. He was a Hungarian who had made his fortune with a phone sex company. Doorbal met him through his ex-girlfriend, who knew Furton, Griga's girlfriend, and introduced Doorbal and Lugo to Griga. They put on a facade as being business partners for a new investment. Meanwhile, Schiller escaped to Colombia after realizing the police wouldn't believe his crazy story. From there, he hired a private detective named Ed Dubois to investigate the kidnapping. Dubois initially brought Schiller's case to the Miami police, but they were skeptical and didn't believe his story. At first, Dubois didn't believe it either, but he knew something for certain. If they had done it once, they would do it again. And he was right. May 25th, 1995, Lugo and Doorbal arranged a final meeting with Frank Griga. They went out to dinner and then brought him back to Doorbal's apartment. In there, they were supposed to close the deal. But in fact, they planned to kidnap him and follow the same procedure as before. Doorbal asked Griga to speak in private. There, in the next room, Doorbal tried to capture Griga. However, Griga fought back, and Doorbal, in desperation, attempted to stop him by hitting him in the head, killing Griga instantly. Griga's girlfriend, Furton, heard the commotion and ran over to find him dead. Lugo panicked and injected her with a horse tranquilizer. Furton survived and woke up very confused, while Lugo tried to force any information out of her. Lugo had to inject her another time with horse tranquilizer, and this last dose, sadly, killed her. The next day, the gang arrived at the same warehouse from before, driving a U-Haul. Inside the van was the bodies of Griga and Furton, hidden inside a couch and a clothing box. The gang was ready to dispose of the bodies, and they did so in the most horrific way possible, cutting them with a chainsaw and chopping off parts of their body with an axe, then burning them and putting them in gallon drums in order to dispose of them in the canal. While all of this is happening, Dubois, the detective hired by Schiller, checked the documents used to steal his fortune. Dubois noticed that these documents were approved because of a notary named John Mess, who apparently was the owner of the Sun Gym where Daniel Lugo worked. Skeptical, Dubois went to the Sun Gym where he wanted to ask some questions about the documents that John Mess notarized. While waiting for John Mess in his office, he noticed that his trash can was overflowing with documents that would be key incriminating evidence against the gang. Dubois took the evidence to the police, however, unfortunately, they dismissed the information. Luckily, after a report of an abandoned Lamborghini that Griga had owned, the police decided to investigate and search Griga's house. A neighbor mentioned seeing two unknown men in the house a few days before, and their descriptions matched with a recent case that Dubois presented about bodybuilders kidnapping a wealthy man. Captain Al Harper noticed this, and a case was built against the Sun Gym gang. The police had another lead when the same ex-girlfriend who presented Doorbal with Griga told the police everything that had happened. Rubbing salt into the wounds, when the police showed Griga's neighbor the picture of Lugo and Doorbal, she identified them and confirmed that these were the men. It was game over. The police arrived at Doorbal's apartment, finding not only Doorbal but Delgado in it. Inside, the police found a lot of evidence relating to Schiller's kidnapping and Griga's and Furton's death, like bloodstains, Griga's business card, and the red leather outfit that Furton was wearing. After all this, Doorbal admitted everything and everyone who was involved. By June 2nd, 1995, the police looked for Lugo in Schiller's house, but they didn't find him. Instead, they discovered that he had fled to the Bahamas. His trip didn't last long, as only 5 days later, he was arrested in Nassau and brought back to Miami. The trial began on February 24th, 1996. Schiller returned to Miami to testify, but at this point, the case wasn't as said and done as one would have thought. This is because both bodies from Griga and Furton were missing. That was until they weren't. At a lagoon, the police would stumble across their bodies stuffed into the gallon drums. And to their surprise, the head, hands, and feet were not inside the drums. Delgado would narrate how the gang decided to throw these parts away on an alligator lagoon. Luckily for the police, they are able to match the serial number from the plastic surgery that Furton had gotten and matched it with the surgeon who had administered it. Furthermore, they found a tooth from Griga. At the end of the day, the police also arrested Mess and many other people involved. Surprisingly, they built a case against Schiller, who was accused of fraud because of his shady finances. He pleaded guilty and received the minimum sentence. Mess, on the other hand, was sentenced to 56 years in prison for his crimes. Delgado testified in favor of the states and was sentenced to 20 years, but only served out 7. Lugo and Doorbal, on the other hand, were both sentenced to death.